Welcome to Conscious Revolution, a podcast about political awakening. My name is Margaret Daftian, and I'm here to help you navigate a confusing world of misinformation, hidden agendas, AI, and cult dynamics. Because it's not enough to just evolve, we must also resist and challenge those destructive influences that distort our evolution. Get in, loser! We're starting a conscious revolution. Hey, welcome back. This is Margaret, and today I have a guest with me, Ash Riley, and we're going to be deconstructing corporate cults. So we often think about cults as being kind of on the fringes of society, like flat earthers or Scientology. But in recent years, we've become more and more aware of mainstream cults that exist right in our backyard, so to speak. And we're starting to see how mega corporations and big businesses function much like a cult and share very similar characteristics of more traditional cults. And they're just as harmful, they're just as toxic, and it's important that we talk about them. So I personally don't have any experience in corporate cults, but Ash does. And she shared with me some unfucking believable stories about her experiences working in like cult-like work environments. And her stories are shocking, but not at all surprising, given the level of employee abuse and exploitation that we know happens, but we don't hear about it, especially from people who have experienced it. And one of the most commonly known corporate cult-like environments is Silicon Valley. And Silicon Valley is notorious for being culty. And there's no better example of this than what's making headlines right now, which is Elizabeth Holmes from Theranos. And we're not going to get into the story of Elizabeth Holmes, and it's going to be too off topic for this, but the reason why I'm bringing attention to it is because, well, first of all, I've been following this crazy story for some time. And for those who don't know about Elizabeth Holmes, you can just Google Theranos. She's like one of the biggest scammers and fraudsters that Silicon Valley has seen. And she has used cult tactics to accomplish her grift. And after being the subject of a scandal, she sort of dipped out of media for a while. And the reason why this is so relevant is because she's just recently resurfaced. The New York Times wrote this article about her. I'll link it in the show notes. But the article is about how she sort of rebranded herself as Liz. And she's now positioning herself as this suburban mother and low-key housewife. And it's just absolutely fascinating that she continues to defend her grift, even though she's been sentenced to 11 years in prison for fraud and conspiracy. And she's still free because she requested a last-minute appeal. So her case is still pending. And now she is attempting to change the narrative. And she's doing it through the media, which is also a cult tactics. It's using an emotional storytelling to manipulate the narrative. So I'm really, really fascinated by this story. And even though we're not going to get into the story itself, it does serve as a good segue into my interview with Ash today about corporate cults and what she has experienced and observed in these kinds of high control, authoritarian work environments. And this will help us to identify some specific qualities that corporate cults share with more traditional cults and some tactics that they use, some red flags to look out for, even some yellow flags. And hopefully we can give you some framework for recognizing the difference between a healthy company culture and a toxic one, because it's not always so obvious. And we'll also talk about why that is. So I'm happy to introduce Ash Riley today. Ash is a trained journalist and business consultant with a wealth of knowledge about marketing and advertising. And not just marketing advertising, but rather ethical and trauma-informed business practices, which is what really attracted me to your account in the first place. Ash was really, you were really the first person that I saw was talking about trauma-informed business practices, the first person that I personally saw. It's something that I had been thinking about because I'm really passionate about corporate social responsibility, but I didn't really have this trauma-informed framework around business itself. It was more about mental health. So it was really interesting for me to see how you are merging the two and talking about the intersection of business and social change. So I was like, hallelujah, someone cares about this stuff. So Ash is the business bullshit detector online, and she has built a small but engaged following of people who are also really inspired by her ideas and her unique way of deconstructing business practices through this framework of trauma-informed ethical business. So the last thing that I'll talk about before we get into it is that something that Ash and I often bounce ideas back and forth with each other is the hypocrisy that we see within a lot of businesses and brands, particularly spiritual businesses and brands that are active in the online coaching space, and how they position themselves as conscious, right? Conscious entrepreneurship or conscious leadership, which is really nothing more than just a buzzword if you're not actually implementing a standard of ethics and social responsibility in your business model or your marketing or your sales. So Ash and I will often say number one, if your business is not ethical, it's not conscious. And number two, if your business is not in some way trying to disrupt systems of inequity and rampant capitalism, then it's not ethical. And there's so much to unpack in those ideas and concepts. So Ash and I have collaborated on a pretty remarkable course. I think it's remarkable because I have not come across any course like this in the business education space. The ideas that you'll find in there are pretty unorthodox, which is exactly what we need right now. We need something radically different than what we have been doing, because there's so much more to building a sustainable business than what is taught even in the graduate level business programs, because they don't teach about businesses being culty. They don't teach about how traditional business models themselves are culty, because capitalism itself is built on a pyramid-shaped, unequal distribution of power. So I'm mentioning this to promote our course. If you're interested in taking a more radical approach to your business and truly building a brand for social impact, and B, because having this framework in mind will add a lot of depth and clarity to my conversation with Ash today. So instead of just seeing these culty, toxic businesses just in isolation, we have a more big picture perspective of how business and society intersect. And especially if you're listening to this and you're an entrepreneur or a business owner, the invitation is to think about where your business and your brand fits within this juncture. Okay, so without further ado, let's get into it. Ash, thank you so much for being here and being a thought leader in this trauma informed business framework. So, my first question for you today is, in your definition, what are corporate cults and what is it that makes businesses susceptible to cult dynamics?
So it's funny because I was actually thinking about this morning, and I think I would define a corporate cult as brand culture taken to the extreme. You know, part of creating the culture of a work environment is connecting it to your brand and your brand values, and then making sure that the way that you run your business is in alignment with those values and that the people that you hire are also aligned with those values. But in my experience in the corporate cult world, it's when the leadership do not actually embody the values that they purport to uphold. So, like in my experience with the place that I worked, they had these very lofty, very altruistic, like core values that everybody, I mean, they had them like on posters on the wall. So they made it seem like these values are really, really important. And yet the CEO of the company embodied absolutely none of them. So it was like more of a pretense of embodying these values than an actual like living in alignment with them. You know, it's like I can't remember any of the actual values that were on the wall anymore, except one, which was candor. And I was praised for being candid, but only when my candidness was not rocking the boat. So if you spoke or said anything or challenged the status quo in any way, it was like completely frowned upon. And then they would look to those values to find a reason to reprimand you and be like, well, you're not being honest or you're not being this or whatever. And try to like use the values as a framework to excommunicate you from the group.
So it's like when it's supposed to be the business culture, but it becomes the business cult. And the business culture is usually based on the values and then like using those values to manipulate people to uphold certain behaviors in the culture, but really it's a cult. So that kind of speaks to like how certain businesses and brands, they have a cult following, and it's so normalized in the way that we talk about it. Like certain skincare brands, it's a cult favorite. And I'm wondering, at what point does that brand, because that's really about brand loyalty. It's like you're so loyal to a brand that you become like indoctrinated into their brand culture in a way. So I'm wondering, what is that point between from brand loyalty, which is a good thing, we want that, to a cult following? And should we even refer to it as a cult following? I don't know.
I think the line where it crosses from, brand loyalty into a literal cult is when the people who are loyal to that brand lose their ability to recognize when that brand is being harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we see
Mm-hmm.
that a lot in the coaching industry. Like people will make excuses for their influencers, their followers, they'll make excuses for celebrities. They will attack anyone who is speaking out against those people for harm or whatever. It's the whole like the narcissist flying monkeys, who don't even actually have, especially online, like people who don't even actually have a real relationship with this person coming to their defense when someone is accusing them of harmful behavior.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that there's this murky territory where we're defending the face of the brand, which is usually an individual, and forgetting that that individual is representing a brand. So it's like we have this relationship with that person because the person itself. I mean, we built all sorts of relationships with people that we admire, but then we forget that, wait, this person is speaking on behalf of a business and a brand, and the business and brand itself is not a person, but we tend to personify also the brand because we've connected in this relational way to the leader.
Well, and I think this even happens with actual corporations. It's easier to do when it's a personal brand because we forget that, because there's a person's face attached to it, we forget that it is actually a business. I mean, there are even examples of when a very beloved brand that produces a product has done something like abuse their employees or something like that. People will still come to that brand's defense, even though they're engaging in harmful business practices. So, it's not even necessarily just when it's a person. It can be anything, really.
Yeah, and that is something that we talk about in our course, is the way that we anthropomorphize a brand. We attribute these human characteristics of like morality and personality to a brand, which is an entity. It's not a person. So I think people need to become aware of how brands actually do encourage this anthropomorphization of their business, so that we can lose our critical ability to discern that difference between this is where the person ends and their business begins. So I think that's probably one thing that I've seen, that threshold between like brand loyalty and to cult following. So I'd love for you to share some of what you've shared with me about your experience working in these very high control corporate cult like environments.
So I've just had like a lot of toxic jobs in general. I wouldn't classify all of them as corporate cults per se, but one of them specifically, I absolutely would. And it's funny because I had never thought of it in that context until you sent me the document with, or all the articles with like the list of the characteristics. And I was like, holy shit, that actually was very culty. I guess it depends on what your idea of small is. I would say there was probably like 50 people working there. So it's still considered a small business, but it was like an online e-commerce company and sold like party planning stuff. And it was started by a woman who started her business on eBay, and she just basically like grew it to the point where she was able to build an actual company out of it. One of the biggest red flags I will tell everybody about going into evaluating a potential job as a toxic work environment is family-owned businesses.
Oh, interesting.
Family-owned businesses, in my experience, are almost always toxic because the toxic family dynamics come right into the business. Lots of nepotism, lots
That makes sense.
favoritism. Yeah. I've worked for a couple of family-owned businesses, and they were both just really horrible places to work. But so this place in particular, several of the owner's children were involved in the business. The marketing department was being run by her 20-something-year-old daughter who went to NYU and studied marketing but didn't graduate. So she was my boss. And like just didn't know a lot about what she was doing. Same with all the other family members. It was like, well, I'm just going to basically like create a job for you. Even though you don't really have experience, I'm also probably going to pay you more than the rest of my employees because you're my child. So that was like one big thing that I wish I had recognized ahead of time. The other interesting thing was that I didn't. So apparently, and this is not necessarily a terrible practice, like when I was interviewing for the job, I was told, oh, everybody interviews with the CEO. And, that makes sense. Like you want to meet the person who's leading the company and they want to meet you, make sure you're a good fit, etc. And for whatever reason, they couldn't work out the schedule and I didn't meet her. If I had, I would have never taken this job. Like this person, period, was a train wreck. Like you could just tell by looking at her. her body language was all weird and off, and she was like this Grateful Deadhead hippie. I'm not even kidding. Like, she came to work one day with her tie-dye dress on inside out. There was like a hole in the side of it, one eyebrow drawn on, like just a mess. Like, she would like hole herself up in the office and almost never come out, and like really actually very rarely had actual engagement with any of the like main level employees. The only people she really talked to on a regular basis was the director of operations and the person who was like managing, she was like the buyer or the main buyer. The three of them, that was like the inner circle. And I think those two were like the original employees. Everybody else was like in a different world, and like those two would snitch on you on anybody else. I mentioned, it was an extremely high control environment. It felt a lot like you were going to prison every day. It was in a warehouse, so like our marketing office had no windows. It was cinder block walls. They were painted white. When I first started, like I was like the second or third marketing employee.
I'm just like taking mental notes of what you're saying as like, okay, I just heard a hierarchical power structure and centralized leadership. Check. I'm just like making mental notes of it. So I might just like interrupt you and be like, oh, that's this.
Yeah. So
Okay,
when I started, there was only 4 people in the marketing department. There was the web guy, the girl who did like the Google ads, the daughter, and then myself. We sat in this cinder block room. All the desks faced forward like a classroom, and it was like dead silent. Everybody worked with headphones. You were not allowed to access.
It was like an open floor plant. Okay.
Yeah. It wasn't cubicles or anything. It was like actual desks. You were not allowed access to the internet while you were there. Like personal access, you could only access like work related stuff, which was weird. I mean, I was running social media for this company, and part of being aware and knowing what's going on with social media is like you have to be in tune with what's happening in the outside world. And this really came back to like bite us in the ass because the Boston Marathon bombing happened and we had no idea. So like, everybody else is like acknowledging what's going on. We had no clue. And the irony was her daughter was there running the marathon. And
wow.
Yeah. So it was just like you were completely closed off from the outside world. And the people in the warehouse weren't even allowed to bring their phones into the building, which I think that's like a normal warehouse code. We were allowed to bring our phones in, but we couldn't be on them. So, really policed like your ability to access the outside world, outside information while you were in the building. The dress code was supposed to be casual, but it was like very militaristically enforced for some people, but not everybody. So like I got sent home for wearing a shirt that didn't come out to here, it came to here.
Whoa.
Sleeveless shirt. Sent home without pay for the day. But yet the operations manager wore a mini skirt with a slit up the back that you could like almost see her vagina.
Wow.
And she would be the person who would go and send people home. So it was like this really bizarre double standard of like what you were allowed to wear. So my boss, like, we eventually hired more people. I was only there for
it's like they used the dress code to establish this like hierarchical power dynamic.
We hired a ton of people over the course of the 8 months that I was there. So the marketing department like blew up. And eventually I had like 2 layers of management over me in the marketing department as well. And so I had a new boss, which I actually knew her from a previous job. We'd worked together, but we had the same pair of like leggings from Target, these gray pants, and she wore them to work all the time. And I straight up told her, I was like, I can't wear those pants because if I did, I would be sent home. But it was because she had a different body type than me. And like there was another girl there who was like a rail thin who wore leggings all the time. And she never got in trouble either. So it was like systemically like picking people who, just stereotypically fit some kind of like patriarchal ideal or whatever, and then discriminating against them.
That's wild.
So there was
and
stuff
it's so blatant too.
Yeah,
Not even
well, and it was
not
so
even
blatant.
subtle.
The head of HR at the time actually went to the operations manager and brought up the fact that she was arbitrarily enforcing this dress code. And this was a man. And, actually said something to her one day about what she was wearing. And he eventually resigned because, he was a very religious person, but he was like, all of the way that this business is run goes against my values and my religious values. And so he resigned, which is kind of crazy. But then the new person who came in to run HR, we found out later, was actually having an affair with the CEO. And I thought this for a long time. I thought she was abusing prescription drugs. I knew she took a lot of Ambien and she couldn't ever sleep. So I thought it was prescription drugs. After I left, I was told, they're like, no, she's actually on crack.
How was she even able to run a business? Because it takes, a level of
that's the
clear-headedness, organization.
I don't think she actually did anything while she was there. But no. Here's another story. We hired somebody to do SEO for all of our products. And the girl we hired told me behind the scenes, she was like, I'll go in and I'll optimize product pages. And then I'll come in the next day and I'll look at them. And she has gone in, the CEO has gone in and edited all the things that I did. But it's terrible. It's bad practice. And that was actually one of the things that led to me getting on her shit list. Was we were talking about search engine optimization and taking a picture off of a blog post that advertised a sale. And she kept trying to say it was going to affect the SEO of the page. And I was like, no, it's not. Because I challenged her and I knew more about the thing than she did. That was a bad thing to do. It was better to let her walk around being completely wrong but thinking she's right than to actually run the business correctly. So it's that level of ego and fragility. And she was very two-faced. So one of the things that I did was we designed and ran photo shoots for all the products and for our blog posts and stuff like that. So we were doing a tailgate photo shoot one day. And she came in and she looked around and she's like, oh, this looks great. This looks wonderful. And then she left. And then my boss came back later, who I actually had a relationship and a rapport with. And she was like, she told me she hates it and she doesn't want it. And she doesn't want to do it. And then we actually ended up posting those and they were some of our best performing Pinterest pins. And after I left, she took it down. It was that important to her that even though the stats and the analytics proved that it was successful, she didn't care because it was more about her personal preference than anything else. And so it was just stuff like that all the time. This was another red flag, and I should have thought about this. Everyone there was paid hourly, which is not normal for anybody working in marketing advertising unless you're an intern or something.
Right.
So it was you agreed on a set salary, but then it was still broken down into an hourly amount. And you literally had to punch in and punch out on a time clock. They had Google email set up. And so she had access to everyone's email accounts. It was kind of strongly suspected that she went into people's email accounts and read their emails. There was such an air of suspicion and paranoia. It was the HR manager might have just walked by your desk and snapped a picture of you while you were doing something. It's almost like they would like gather evidence to find reasons to fire people or to reprimand them. So it was just like you're constantly watching your back for whatever reason. And they would find reasons. If you showed up to work 5 minutes late, regardless of the reason, you were sent home without pay. And I mean, there were people working there who needed, and they didn't have health insurance. There were no health benefits. There were people working there who needed the money and who stayed there in an extremely abusive environment because they didn't know that they could get a job anywhere else. And one person that I know who worked there was fired, and then they hired him back. And he went back because he needed the money. I've been at multiple businesses who've done that, actually, where like the first time around, we were in the middle of a recession in 2008, and they laid a bunch of people off. They laid an employee off who was pregnant, by the way. And then after she had the baby, they hired her back for less money than she was being paid before. And she took it because she needed the money. So it's just like, you know, figuring out ways to screw people over and doing it intentionally. And just like the level of professionalism was like in the gutter.
Yeah, well, they know they're going to get away with these things because people,
well, and
they're desperate for work.
Yeah. So when they fired someone, they would try to talk you into resigning because they didn't want to pay your unemployment, which is illegal. They would tell you, well, it's going to look bad.
I don't know why I feel like so many companies probably do that.
Oh, I'm
It's
sure.
probably a strategy.
They tell you, oh, it's going to look bad on your resume if you've been fired from a job. So we're doing you a favor by letting you resign. Then when you go interview for another job, you can say that you left that job. Just complete mindfuck.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think I told you when I was, talking about our personal stories, but when I was only there for 8 months. And at that point, like my ex-husband, we were still married, but he was like, I was coming home every day and like drinking a bottle of wine to try to just like decompress from this super toxic environment. And he was like, you're not yourself anymore. I think you need to find another job. And it was like, at that point, we had talked about, he was encouraging me to actually like start my own business and start freelancing. But he initially wanted me to do that on the side while I was still working full time for this place. And I was like, I can't do that. Like there's so much stress in this job. I can't possibly try to start a business on the side while we're doing this. So he finally agreed to like let me quit and start to build my own business. But here's the funny story. I knew that I had gotten on the radar because like the amount of people watching me being reprimanded and that started to like increase. But so I knew I was going to quit, but we were going on vacation in December to, I think it was Cancun or something, or maybe it might've been Costa Rica actually. But so it was like December, we were down there. We ended up getting stuck because of an ice storm in Dallas and we couldn't come back until like the next day, until they cleared the airport. So I ended up emailing them and saying, hey, I can't come back until tomorrow because I'm still on vacation. And I think like that was like their last straw, was like, well, you didn't come back on the day you said you were going to come back. It was hilarious because I intended to give them my notice that day anyway. But the day I came in to give them my notice, they went to try to fire me. And there's another side story there too, because they ended up hiring a marketing director who was above the person I directly reported to. And that guy threw me under the bus to save his own ass. But so he comes to get me and he starts walking me to the front office and he's like, this wasn't my idea. And I'm like, okay, clearly, obviously, probably getting fired. Don't care.
Yeah.
But they did the thing where they were like, we think you should resign. Because if I had thought about it and been more spiteful, I would have been like, no, fire me so you can pay the unemployment. But I wasn't planning to get another job, so that didn't really make any sense because you have to be actively looking for jobs while you're on unemployment. But I would have done it out of spite. It was just weird because then, as I was collecting my things and walking out to my car, the person that I reported to was like walking me out to my car and telling me how brilliant I was and what great work I did. And it was just like, you're being fired not because you aren't doing a good job. You're being fired because you're better at what you're doing than the person who owns the company.
Wow. Unbelievable.
I took like a whole month off and did nothing just to like emotionally decompress and detox.
Yeah, I'm sure.
That environment for 8 months. And the sad part is I did some of the best work I've ever done because I actually loved what I was doing and I loved the people that I was working with, like that were directly on my team. And I was very emotionally connected and involved and attached to the work itself because it was very creative and it allowed me to do a lot of things that I didn't get to do in a lot of other jobs. But I've since learned that unless I am my own boss, I can't be emotionally attached to the quality of my work because that in and of itself will keep me trapped in toxic environments longer than is necessary. But, for all the people who were working there who didn't have the level of privilege that I had, in that I had a spouse who was working full time and it was not a big deal, not a huge hit to our income for me to leave without having another job lined up. People who aren't in those positions get stuck in places like that and they get abused and they have nowhere to go. And I've been stuck in toxic work environments like that previously, twice, as a single person, my only source of income, knowing I had no place to go, once during a recession. And it's like you have no other choice but to keep showing up to a place where you're going to be abused. And that is complex trauma in a nutshell. Trapped, helpless, no place to go.
Yeah. So in that story, okay, so there's a few themes coming up. There's the high control environment where they control what you wear, how you express yourself. They control when to send you home. And it's an arbitrary thing. They control your access to outside information.
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing a lot of like manipulation and coercion there, a lot of fear-based tactics, the hacking into your email account, watching your back. That's a big one. I'm hearing abusive power from the leadership. What else? Was there like an idolizing? Because a lot of times there's some like idolization that goes on.
I think the CEO wanted people to idolize her.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't necessarily say that a lot of people did. Like everybody back in the marketing department was like, this place is terrible.
Oh, okay.
But I think the people in customer service were a little more like her little minions. Definitely the operations manager and the merchandising person were her minions for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you crossed one of them, you were out of the picture very quickly.
Yeah, that's another thing, that the theme of thinking a lot of these groups, or these toxic leaders, they think that they are above the law and they can literally just do whatever they want. And employee well-being, certain standards of practice that apply to the workplace. I mean, none of that applies to them because they actually literally think that they are above the law, above the requirements. So that's another big theme that I'm hearing. And obviously that is on the other side of that coin is employee exploitation.
I just remembered one more thing. They implemented a policy in the employee handbook while I was there that they could search your car as long
Okay,
as
that's
you were
illegal.
not.
That's illegal, right? Yeah.
I
They
mean, like,
literally think the law doesn't apply to them. It's wild.
yeah, it was just like getting really, really crazy. And yet they were like, oh, but we've relaxed on the dress code. We allow open toed shoes now.
Oh, great.
Okay.
They're like, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Oh, and this
So,
was the other thing too. Like her daughter would come to work wearing whatever she wanted.
yeah, that's the hierarchy
Yeah, but
that
if
they use
I
the
wore the
dress code.
same thing that she
Hmm.
wore, like we went to the same meeting, dressed the same way, I got in trouble. She did not. As soon as her daughter left, everything that her daughter used to wear to work was implemented into the dress code as you can't dress like this. It was
Yeah.
wild.
Yeah. Those are some major red flags.
A lot of it was things that you don't know this until you get there. So it's like hard to screen for those things up
Hmm.
front.
Hmm.
You have no idea how the people are going to actually be there. Like when they present it to you in the interview, it sounds fantastic. It's like, oh, we have this great company culture and we don't take ourselves too seriously. And, it's the brand facade is shown to you in the interview process. And you're like, you think, oh, wow, this is going to be great.
Right.
And then you get there and it's like, holy shit. This is not what I signed up for.
Yeah. Yeah. So some yellow flags even in the recruitment strategy. I was like, how can we assess that? And there was this article, I'll link it to in the show notes, about how even in like the recruitment strategy, it can resemble similar to cult indoctrination, where, they screen people for fit
Mm-hmm.
and alignment. And they usually choose people, they have a way of choosing those people that they might know that this person is desperate for a job, so they're gonna do whatever it takes to keep the job. They might choose people based on a number of things, maybe appearance, maybe age.
Well, and here's the other thing. Like I said, I didn't interview with the CEO, and they said everyone interviews with her. Her daughter hired me. Her daughter wanted to hire me. That's why I got hired. I suspect if I
Uh-huh.
had actually interviewed with the CEO, they would have never made an offer to me, but that's fine because I would never have taken it.
Right. So maybe they realized that you were more of a critical thinker, that maybe you weren't as, wide-eyed and naive, and so knew that they had to shelter you from the train wreck
Yeah.
that they didn't want you to see. So that could definitely have been, I mean, we can only speculate. But I know that, for example, that article that I was talking about, he was talking about Apple and how Apple tends to recruit these younger employees who have, they're already kind of immersed in the Apple ecosystem and they're really big fans of Apple. And just the fact that they could get a job at Apple it makes them cry. And that's one way that you can easily turn a fan into a fanatic.
That's also how a lot of coaches operate because
Right.
they have built these parasocial relationships and positioned themselves as
Yes.
influencers. And then they pull in clients who are just starry eyed to be working with them. Here, take my money.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that you mentioned that this article also mentioned is that like the aspirational values. Brands have these really, really beautiful, glorious, aspirational high values, and they use that to instill like a level of employee morale. And what that author was saying of this article, going back to Apple, is that it often is at the cost of paying people really, really shitty salaries, even though the company itself is a, multi-trillion-dollar company. They know that people will sacrifice their money for this higher purpose. This is an example of exploitation, right? It's a manipulation.
So another thing, and if they're trying just as hard to sell the job to you as you are to get the job, that might be a red flag.
That's a good point.
And this happens a lot with startups in general because most of them have very limited funding and they can't afford to pay you a lot. So instead, they're like, well, you can get shares in the company. And they go really hard at like selling you on the mission to get you excited about working for them, even though they can't pay you very much.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not necessarily that means that they're going to be a cult, but it's definitely something that happens, and
it's a yellow flag.
Yeah.
It's a yellow flag. Yeah, it's not as obvious. Another yellow flag that you mentioned that might not be as obvious is they really encourage their employees to, well, actually, I don't know if you mentioned this. Were there any like special kind of, well, the dress code can be seen as maybe something ritualistic, but I know that these companies tend to have like these special rituals that are a little bit strange. And you might not know it up front because it's not always a sign of a red flag. There's such a thing as, for example, motivational team building. And I think that it's important to have that. But then there's like other things that are it's strange. Like there's the company jingles and songs and, you have to chant the company's name like 3 times.
I feel like that was a thing, but I can't remember. I do remember we would have these, I think it was like once a month. Everybody would have to go to like this group meeting and she would sit in the floor and like talk about stuff. I honest to God, like a lot of the stuff that happened there has been wiped from my memory.
You probably blocked it out.
That and a lot of other things over the last 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like there was something that we did that was kind of like that. But that stuff always reminded me of church and it made me deeply uncomfortable anyway. So I was always like, this is fucking weird.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because the author of this article that is kind of like exposing the culty ways of Apple, I think he used to work at IBM and he said that their motivational like team building exercises and anything that they did outside of the company and positioned it as motivational team, he described it as feeling like he's at church, like he's at some like evangelical.
Well, and I think I mentioned this to you as well.
Yeah.
The CEO was Orthodox Jewish.
Uh-huh.
And so like a lot of the dress code stuff came from that. And also like if we had like a company event, the food had to be kosher for everybody, not just her or her family.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of like very subtly kind of like pushing your religious beliefs on everybody else.
Yeah, it is subtle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But yellow flag for sure. There's also special lingo. Did you have any experience with that? Like this specialized language that companies use?
Sort of. Not internally, but like externally as part of the brand, definitely. Like she referred to herself as idiot in chief, which was supposed to be funny, and I don't take myself seriously, but it was actually very accurate. But like
I don't think it's ironic if it's true.
Oh, but like if you go on the Glassdoor reviews for this company, I mean, it's just like a laundry list of people complaining who have worked there, whatever. But she replies to every single one and like has a reason why, even though it's anonymous. Like you don't know who those people are unless you like pick up details from what they're saying. She will reply to all of them and be like, this employee, an awful person, and blah, 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 blah. It's just like damage control
Mm-hmm.
Central. And then you can obviously tell that she has like asked other people to go and post positive reviews to try to like counteract the negative ones. So yeah, if you look at a company's Glassdoor page and there's like a shitload of negative reviews and then a shitload of people claiming, no, that's not true, it's probably a red flag. I looked at the Glassdoor reviews before I joined this company because I'd been in so many other toxic environments. I was like, And at that time, the company I think was so new, there was only like a handful. And the only negative one on there was from somebody in the warehouse. And I was like, okay, the office is probably different than the warehouse. I don't know, but I'll take it with a grain of salt. And like after being there, and then after they like staffed up, it just kept going and going and going. And like I occasionally will go back and just, like once or twice over the last, it's been probably almost 10 years since I worked there. Yeah, I think I worked there in 2013, so it has been 10 years. But like, I think twice over the last 10 years have I gone back and like just checked in on the Glassdoor to see what's going on. And it's still the same old, same old.
Well, the leadership hasn't changed.
No,
So.
and it never will because it's a family owned business.
Yeah.
And
Right.
this person, much like many tech startups, was a person who basically just like named themselves CEO and king of the island. They didn't earn their way into that position. And that is true of many tech founders.
Mm-hmm.
They create their own little fiefdom and run it however they want, and they end up creating a toxic culture. Uber is a great example. The guy who was the CEO of Uber, their work culture was so toxic, he got ousted by his board. Same thing happened to Steve Jobs.
I was going to say Steve Jobs.
For a lot of these companies, like as long as they're making money, they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
But I think with Uber, it was like complaints about sexism and sexual harassment and that kind of thing. So it was like getting a lot of really bad press. And at that point, I guess like if they start to get a reputation around Silicon Valley for being a terrible place to work, then they've got to do something because otherwise they're not going to be able to hire anybody.
Okay, so we talked about some obvious red flags and maybe some not so obvious red flags, yellow flags rather. So what about some green flags? Now let's talk about some ways that companies can promote a healthy company culture. I think a great place to start, because where you started initially talking about your experience, is the leadership, because I think it really does start at the top. It always starts at the leadership. It's imperative to do a little background check and check out, okay, what kind of person is this? What kind of leader are they? And not just the leader themselves, but also like the leadership team, the management team.
And that's hard to do because unless people are speaking up publicly about them, everything that those people have, like on their LinkedIn profile or whatever, is curated to make them look good,
Right. Yeah.
So really the only avenue that you have is something like Glassdoor.
To
see the real story of what's going on in that place. So, one or two negative reviews, okay, you might have had somebody who wasn't happy. And
yeah, there's always going to be disgruntled employees.
People are more likely to leave a negative review than a positive one.
Yeah.
That is true. But when there's just a mountain of them, and when it's like obvious that people are so angry and so fired up that they want to go and like leave, the more people write in the negative review also. Like if you're willing to write a novel about your experience at this place, like that's saying something more than just, I'm going to fire off something because I'm not happy. It's like taking the time to thoroughly outline like what's going on at this place, and you see multiple things like that. That's also a pretty accurate indication that it's probably not great. And the same thing happens with coaches as well, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they try to silence people and bully them into silence with, threatening to sue them or whatever. And it's lucky that Glassdoor, this is the difference between the online business world and the real business world, is that the real business world has more concrete consequences, and those people know that it's illegal for them to keep somebody from posting a negative review. Online business world, most of those people have no fucking clue about any kind of laws about business, and they just do whatever they want because they think they can. So,
Yeah.
like, businesses with actual real teams of lawyers have to abide by a certain standard.
And I also get a little bit suspicious now when I only see positive reviews, especially if it's like a very big company,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm like, there has to be one or two, not that I'm actively looking for somebody to say something negative, but it just makes me a little bit more critical, because there's gotta be one or two people who didn't have who don't have something really positive to say. So when I see like, and I'm not just talking about, oh, this was a great place to work or whatever. It's like a whole paragraph about how amazing. It's so over the top. It's so extra that it makes me just wonder if there is, first of all, if there's a level of open communication that is allowed or encouraged in the company, which is so important for a healthy environment. Open communication,
This is
feedback.
the crazy thing is, I think this, as you're talking about this, like I'm remembering, things are coming back. I think they did an employee survey once where they asked us to give
Oh,
them anonymous feedback, and we did, which I
oh,
suspect was deeply negative. I don't remember what the consequences were of that, but I do like vaguely recall that happening. And I'm pretty sure nothing changed afterward either. It
fascinating.
was weird because like they thought they were doing all the right things. It was all very twisted and
Mm-hmm.
inverted, really.
Right. Well, the author of this article that I was talking about, something that really, it blew my mind. So apparently Apple, maybe they don't do this anymore. I don't know, but this is what the article talked about. Apparently Apple has employee satisfaction survey that they give, and they have some weird special name for it that it's like something about for our people. I don't know. Anyway, so they ask employees to rate their satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10 about how likely they are to recommend a job at Apple to their family and friends. And they actually they use that survey not to actually solicit a response that's authentic, but they do it so that they can separate people into promoters versus detractors. So those people, those employees who mark like a 9 and above are considered promoters, and those who mark a 7 and below are considered detractors. And I don't know what they do with that information, but it's not really a satisfaction survey if you're
Well, that's
using
also crazy that a 7 and below is considered
yeah, it's like a 7 is actually pretty high.
anything above 50%, above a 5,
Yeah.
if we're talking a scale
Yeah.
of 1 to 10,
That shocked me. Yeah.
would be positive. But so they're like going for like the
Mm-hmm.
real
Mm-hmm.
hardcore, like indoctrinated people.
Yes. Culty AF. What
Yeah.
is culty AF? Another thing, because we were talking about brand values and how they really promote this alignment, this idea of like, are employees a good fit? Are they aligned with the brand values? Well, at what point is the employee aligned, truly aligned with the company's values, versus are they just kind of like coerced to? And that's kind of what another thing that author was talking about, is that a lot of these employees, because there's such a implicit and also sometimes explicit level of intense, like in group out group dynamic that happens, a lot of people just feel coerced to adopt the company's values, not because they're actually aligned with those values.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess a good place to start just for yourself if you're working at a company is, okay, am I actually aligned with these values, or do I feel like, is there like some fear in me that if I don't feel aligned, then I'm going to face some negative consequences?
Or I'm gonna just feel like the odd man out.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
that one too. The in-group, out-group dynamics. Yes.
I think a lot of people go along with that stuff externally, not necessarily internally,
Mm-hmm.
but externally, because they just don't want to be the weirdo,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm. Also, fair wages, right? If people are being compensated fairly for their work.
Yeah, big red
Um,
flag is if a business will not give you more money than your current job, or not like they'll only give you like $3,000 more, not
mm-hmm.
a significant pay raise. They shouldn't be figuring out like how much are willing to pay you based off of your previous salary. They should
Right.
like really people should not be asking you your salary history, period. They shouldn't be. So
Interesting.
that's like a huge red flag to me as well, because it's like you have a stated salary range on your, well, not all states require you to have a stated salary range, some of them do. But if it's publicly facing, it's like, okay, this is the range. You pay me based on my experience, not based on what I made at my previous job. Because if I, for example, in my life, my first job out of college screwed me out of 15 grand a year. I was supposed to be being paid $35,000 a year, and I only got paid 20. So if every job after that based my salary on my previous salary, I was in a hole for
Right.
years that took me, 7, 8 years to get out of, to get back to like a place where I was in a salary range where I should have been. And like every other job I went to, it was like, oh, we'll give you $3,000 more. Here's $2,000 more. Never really getting a raise.
Mm-hmm.
And then, at one point I actually got like a $10,000 pay raise between jobs. And that was just like, oh my God, I can afford things now. It was incredible. So, make sure that a company is willing to pay you what you're worth, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
market value. Look at the market value of
Yeah.
what your position is worth. Obviously, there's going to be people who are going to be like, well, the benefits are really good. Ask the hard questions. Say, I want to see your company handbook. I want to see all the documentation about your benefits. I want to know every last detail, because people will lie,
Yes.
especially if it's at a really super toxic place.
Yes. Another thing that you want to make sure is encouraged is, like I was mentioning, feedback, open feedback, healthy debates, healthy people challenging. Like, you were not encouraged at all to challenge. You were only rewarded for your candor when it was an agreement, but you were punished or discouraged when it was not an agreement. So that is a huge red flag. You're definitely discouraging critical thinking. You're discouraging people's individuality.
Or
And
even
so,
just like it was frowned upon to even make suggestions to make things better.
yeah, yeah.
It's
I
like,
mean,
hey,
listening to employees should be one of the biggest green flags that you look for,
yeah,
because that means that the company is constantly willing to adopt new ideas and healthy practices, and it's evolving and not so stuck and stagnant in their ways, which it can happen. But then if they're also at the same time discouraging any open feedback, any kind of, open communication from their employees, then that means that they can just as easily take your rights away.
mm-hmm.
And another thing that I didn't see in any of the articles, unfortunately, that I was researching for this episode is, how do they treat socially marginalized employees. Because if you remember that big kind of scandal that was happening around the time that Dave Chappelle released The Closer, and the trans community was very offended, and the person who organized like a walkout was a Black trans single mother, and they fired her for organizing this walkout.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge red flag for me.
Same thing happened at
Is
Google.
right.
The person running, like one of their AI researchers came out and was like, hey, your AI is biased. And she was fired. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay, I wanted to just finish this off with some suggestions that we can give to our audience about what are some ways that we as consumers can navigate this paradox that we're in, where, we're both being either directly or peripherally harmed by some of these like toxic companies that we know are culty. For example, Apple, Netflix, Amazon. But at the same time, we're sort of dependent on these companies. Like, for example, I'm completely immersed in the Apple ecosystem. I can't even imagine like breaking away from that right now. It's like so overwhelming. I order from Amazon out of convenience. I have a Netflix account. Like, none of these things have necessarily deterred me from it, and there's some cognitive dissonance there for me sometimes, where I'm like, I hate that I'm supporting these companies, because you really do vote with your dollars. But at the same time, and I know I'm not alone in this, and that's why I'm bringing it up, we are immersed in this, because that sort of speaks to this general idea of, we know that our rampant consumerist capitalist environment is also harming us, but at the same time, we have to operate within those systems because we live and work in those systems. We don't really have much choice right now. So I'm always trying to think of like, okay, how can I navigate this in a way where not only do I reduce my cognitive dissonance, but I actually protect myself, and how can I navigate this more seamlessly? So I don't know if you have any suggestions for that.
I mean, it's hard. It's really hard.
It's hard, yeah.
I try to force myself to get out of convenience, because convenience is privilege.
Right.
So, I will try to do what I can to sacrifice convenience sometimes when it comes to like, can I go to a mom and pop store around the corner and buy this thing instead of ordering it from Amazon or whatever? Other times though, it's like, if I have been super burned out, I have no energy. I like cannot fathom leaving my house, and I can't muster the energy to even feed myself. Convenience is really helpful. So, I think it's important that we check in with ourselves and do what we need to do to support ourselves and our mental health. But when we are healthy and able to do more, then take that route. Tech wise, it's like you have kind of,
that's the hardest part.
I don't want to say that you have limited options, because you don't, but the truth is some products are just better quality than others. But I will be honest, the quality of Apple's products have been going down over the last 10 years.
Oh yeah, I agree. I have some friends and family that are tech enthusiasts, and they're always talking shit about Apple. And it's like, Apple has built a brand. You guys are, it's just the same with like Beats by Dre. Beats by Dre headphones, their quality is such shit. But because they've done such a really good job in, that marketing and the brand identity, and they've built a cult following, and their packaging, it's the works, right? It's the presentation of it. We tend to be gravitated towards that, which is such a human bias. We want the presentation. Like, if it's a shitty steak, but it's presented nicely, we're gonna be biased into thinking that it's actually more delicious than it is. just because we're so sensitive to these other cues from the environment, especially when it has to do with our senses. So I guess one way is to just become aware, right? Become aware that, wait, am I actually enjoying this? Is this actually good because it's good? Is it because it's quality? Or am I being swept away by luxury branding and, these other cues that are being signaled to me about who I am and what I value through the brand aesthetics. So that's a hard thing to do, but it is so important in becoming like a conscious consumer.
Yeah.
And we talk about this a lot in our course.
Yeah, for sure.
So, okay, well, thank you, Ash. This was a really enlightening conversation for me and hopefully for those listening. If you follow Ash on social media, or if you don't follow her yet, at Ash Riley, I definitely recommend giving her a follow. Her insights are incredible. I learned so much just from your stories on Instagram. And I know I'm not the only one who's told you before that they look forward to your stories in every day with like their morning coffee, because it's just like, it's good cerebral stimulation for me to wake up my brain in the morning. Ash also hosts a private Facebook group. There's over 1,000 people in there, like-minded people.
No, not 1,000. There's only like 300-ish in the business
Oh,
room.
really?
Yeah.
Oh,
My
I thought
Facebook group
when I
has like
went on.
100 people. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, we have some great in-depth conversations in there about all things spirituality and business. And I also highly recommend perusing through Ash's blog posts on her website. And I'll link that in the show notes. But she has a really great collection of blog posts about toxic spirituality in the new age. And you're kind of an OG in like the thought leadership around the new age to white supremacy pipeline. You really break that down. And are you still offering, because Ash is also really passionate about astrology. I know that you were offering readings, and is there anything else that you're offering that you'd like people to know about? And do also maybe consulting, right?
Yeah. So I am closing down astrology readings. Those are going to be ending
Oh,
at the end
okay.
of May. So if this comes out before June 1st and you want to book one, squeeze in there while you still can.
Good to know.
Yeah. So I have like a 90-minute like business consultation kind of session where you can basically just like pick my brain, ask me any kind of business related questions you have. And those are $200 for 90 minutes. I have other services that I think they're up on my page as well. Like you can do a business audit if you want to look at, how is my business doing kind of in terms of ethics or trauma informed stuff. I definitely have sort of like a niche in working with people who are trying to pivot from traditional business into something more trauma informed or ethical. So like if you have taken a trauma informed training and you're now ready to implement that framework through your business, marketing, products, everything, like I can work with you to kind of like review everything that you're planning to do and then give you feedback about where you can make changes, how you can make those changes.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. And for those who are more into the self-paced courses, I'm going to remind you again that we do have this course. It's a 10-hour course, Ethical Entrepreneurship 101. It's 10 hours, $150, 4 modules that are very foundational to how we think ethical business should be practiced as professionals and educators in this field. I'm also bringing my own academic training and experience in consumer psychology. So between Ash and I, there's like over 20 years of knowledge that we have packed into this 10-hour self-paced course. So definitely check that out. We've
I was just gonna
really
say, like, it's not necessarily even just what we think. Like everything in this
Right.
course is like backed up
Oh,
by
yes, of course. Yeah,
actual
yeah, yeah.
information. So it's not just like kind of like our opinion,
Yeah.
but it's like
Yeah,
our
yeah, yeah.
learned opinion.
Yes, yes. That's why I mentioned it's based on our professional experience as experts in this field. So, yeah, we are both very, very passionate about ethics. As independent educators, we are constantly creating more and more content around it. We'd love to do more courses and offer people more ways, more avenues to learn. So all of the proceeds from this course we have decided are going to go directly into supporting the independent education around this. Because like I said, this is not mainstream knowledge yet, but I really think that it's going to be, where we have tapped into something that is just sort of like in its initiation. And there's going to be a wave. It's a freaking tsunami. I just know it based on what we know about consumer trends and how consumers are now gravitating towards businesses and brands that are ethical, that are aligned, that do care about social issues and the environment. So we are just catching that first wave of that. And I think it's so cool that we can offer something to people. So yeah, if you find value in our free content, you're definitely going to love what we have to offer in this course. And we would really appreciate your support. And in our mission to promote ethical, trauma-informed, and purpose-driven entrepreneurship. So otherwise, if you have no concluding remarks, I think we've wrapped up. It's a wrap. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. If you have any corporate culty stories, please share them. We'd love to hear it. And I'll link everything that we talked about in the show notes. So thank you so much. Thank you, Ash. And we'll see you next time. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast. And if you share it on social media, don't forget to tag me at Seek with Sarah. For my ebooks, courses, or to work with me one-on-one, visit my website, seekwithsarah.com. I appreciate you hanging out with me. Thanks for pressing play. See you next time.